Well, the future is yours. Unleash your full potential for future competitiveness in an environment that is changing exponentially in terms of speed and direction. Learning how to learn is a very important countermeasure. Okay? I'll talk about this subject in this video. I'll talk about revolutionary change in speed and direction, and education in the age of convergence. Basically, I will address talent needed and dilemma of existing education and major paradigm shift in this age of convergence. All right? Then I'll talk about context-oriented education, and I will introduce Barbara Oakley's Learning How to Learn. Okay? I will introduce her talk at Google about learning how to learn. Okay? Okay. Revolutionary changes in speed and direction. Okay? So since telephone was invented in 1876, more than 110 years, people have enjoyed voice communication service, and after the introduction of internet service, people have put a lot of investment, right? There was economic bubble burst, finally. So, economic bubble burst of the ICT industry in only 16 years from the beginning of internet service. Okay? From the bubble burst, 6 years later, Steve Jobs introduced the smartphone and mobile revolution occurred. And after that, the exponentially changing age of intelligent information services is being driven by the convergence of artificial intelligence and ICT, including IoT, cloud, big data, mobile, and blockchain, right? And quantum computing is coming also. So, change of direction is really exponential. So, you never know what's going to happen when, right? So, someone said most disruptions are ahead of us, okay? So, two things are really uncertain: convergence and exponential trajectory, right? So, we are living in this uncertain age, okay? So, revolutionary changes occur in speed and direction these days, okay? Education for the right direction is extremely important in the changed future. You might be competitive if you are expert in certain area, and you might be also competitive if you are well disciplined in certain area. However, in the future, these are not enough. You really have to develop talent in learning agility, adaptability, empathy, and transdisciplinary, right? Now, let's look at the dilemma of existing education. Existing education no longer accepts the pace and amount of change in society. And earlier I talked about change in speed, and change of direction, right? So existing education uh, cannot follow up these changes. So no matter how hard the university works, it cannot accommodate the demand of society. That's the dilemma. Since most of the changes are made in society, the school's existing education system wiggles and fails to follow. The existing content-based education has reached its limitation. For example, artificial intelligence. Most of our breakthrough results are coming out from Google and some major research institute in the industry. And the Stanford, MIT, and Harvard, all these top-notch universities are working very hard. However, the industry is moving faster than academia. So these days, these top-notch universities, so Stanford, MIT, Harvard, and all these top-notch universities are closely working with the research institute together, from Google and Apple and Facebook and all the major uh, industry research institute. So a lot of things are changing to conquer the limitation of existing education. So the context of education, adapt to social change, the learn how to learn is extremely important for the direction of education. So it's important to follow the change of direction, okay? Now, you really have to realize the occurrence of a major paradigm shift to make yourself competitive, right? For the learning objective, from mastery of basic skills and knowledge to development of a whole person across multiple intelligences. The role of educator, from expert to facilitator, right? Role of educator is extremely important, from expert to facilitator. The educators were trying to teach what they know, but in the future, educators should address issues or subject for what students are supposed to know. That's a big difference. Now, learner experience is a factory model, passive, structured, and directive. As students uh, try to learn whatever teachers uh, push or direct to learn. But in the future, the learner's experience is really a custom model, active, self-directed, and explanatory. The target age, undergraduate, is shifting from college studies to lifelong learning. This is really important. So in the past, if you learn things from universities or colleges, you can use that knowledge or uh, whatever you practiced, and you can apply them in the field, right, for a while. But in the changing future, things are changing so fast, so you have to keep on updating yourself, right, for the changing environment. So you continuously learn something and adapt something. So that's different. Expertise. In the future, in the past, teacher knows the best. And in the future, anyone can teach. Everyone can teach and access the physical classroom. And these days, you can learn or teach anytime, anywhere, and any device. Again, it's extremely important to realize the occurrence of this major paradigm shift, right? Then you can try to make yourself competitive, okay? So I emphasize context-oriented education throughout the courses I offer. The context-oriented education is different from previous content-oriented education. In previous content-oriented education, a fixed answer is important. The answer for what, right? And recurring job. And if you get good grade, you may get a good job in certain area. Spec training, you get certificate from some field, then you may have a better chance to get a job. The separation of education and society, and it was lecture-oriented education. This culture is changing to context-oriented education, which emphasizes on try to be motivated. Why? Asking questions is extremely important to be motivated, right? And how to think. There are a lot of new jobs and creative, adaptive education and entrepreneurship and challenge spirit, adapt to social change, knowledge convergence, and process assessment is extremely important. Not only the result, the process of doing homework assignment and term project is extremely important. And also artificial intelligence is really, today's artificial intelligence technology is process-driven, data-driven. So process-oriented assessment is extremely important. So the training to apply what you learn to real-world applications while improving your ability to cope with change. That is, learn how to learn is extremely important.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to begin by telling you a little story, another one. And this story is about, well, I think all of us love to watch other people, right? To some greater or lesser extent. And I love people watching. And so I have to tell you about this one guy who was one of the most interesting people I've ever watched. And this was when I was working down in Antarctica at McMurdo Station. And this guy's name was Neil. And Neil was this thin, wispy little guy with kind of a high-pitched voice. And he had a big head, so he looked like this sort of upside-down exclamation point. And what Neil used to like to do is he liked to pick up the phone and answer it with a perfect imitation of the 6'8" gorilla of a station manager, Art Brown. So one day, phone rings. Neil picks it up, as usual. Hello, this is Art Brown speaking. And it was Art Brown on the other end of the line. So Art says, who the heck is this? Or more unprintable words to that effect. And Neil says, why, Art, this is you. I'm so glad you've finally gotten in touch with yourself. And so that's actually what we're going to do here today, is to help you to get more in touch with yourself and what you're doing when you're doing one of the most important things you can do as a human being, and that is to learn new things. Now, to start, I have to tell you a little bit about my background in growing up. I grew up moving all over the place. By the time I'd hit 10th grade, I'd lived in 10 different places. Now, moving around a lot like this has some benefits, but it also has some drawbacks or potential drawbacks. And one of the things for me was math is a very sequential topic. And if you miss it anywhere along the line, right, somebody's a little bit further ahead and you're from a school where it was a little behind, all of a sudden you can actually fall off the bandwagon and then you've fallen off. It's hard to get back on. And that's what happened to me early on. I fell off the math bandwagon, just said, I can't do this, I hate it, I really want nothing to do with it at all. Science is the same way, and so I basically flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science. And it's really funny thinking back on it now because I'm a professor of engineering. And I publish well in some of the top journals, so I do very well as an engineer. But one day, one of my students found out about my sordid past as a math flunky. And he asked me, he said, how'd you do it? How'd you change your brain? And I thought, how did I do it? I mean, looking back on it, I was just this little kid and I loved animals and I liked fluffy, furry things. I liked to knit and I loved language and studying language. And at that time, there weren't college loans that were relatively straightforward to get. And so I really wanted to learn a language. And I couldn't afford to go to school. And so how could I study language if, in that kind of situation? And there was one way I could do it. I could actually go and learn a language and get paid for it while I was doing it. And that was to join the Army. And so that's what I did. I joined the Army, and there you see me looking incredibly nervous, about to throw a hand grenade. And I did learn a language. I learned Russian, and I ended up working out on Russian trawlers, Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and that's me standing on a bunch of fish there. I can still swear quite well in Russian, although the rest of the Russian's a little rusty. But I loved having adventures and gaining new perspectives. And so I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that's where I met my husband. So I always say, I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man, and I did. So the thing is, though, what was going on was I began to realize that, I was always interested in these new perspectives, but they were always sort of perspectives that I was kind of comfortable with somehow, and having adventures, that's sort of a comfortable thing. But I wasn't actually kind of stretching myself to really have a totally new perspective. I thought back on the engineers that I'd worked with, West Point engineers, who were in the military, and I realized that their problem-solving skills were, in many ways, exceptional. They could think in a way that I couldn't think. And I thought, what if I could read these kinds of equations like they could read equations? What if I could, in some sense, learn the language that they were able to speak? Could I actually change my brain to learn in that way, to learn what these people knew?
Whenever learning things and tackling tough problems, people always say, well, break it down into smaller parts that you know how to do. And so I wondered how that fits into the focus and diffuse mode, because that seems kind of like breaking a diffuse problem into a bunch of focus problems.
It actually, what that really relates to is that idea of chunks. So remember that you've got 4 slots in working memory. The more you can understand one simple part of it, and make it into a chunk, and then another little aspect of it, make that into a chunk, and then another one, and then, so you're focusing to do that, and then in diffuse mode, you're reaching up above and making the connection randomly when you're sleeping, out for a walk, taking a shower, all these kinds of things. So they all are related, but actually that's great advice. If you try and learn it all at once, it's so overwhelming. It's like your little prefrontal cortex is scrambling madly, but it's overwhelmed. So you want to just get a piece of it so you can draw that up as a ribbon.
a chunk requires understanding. So when there is a chunk or that means that there was an experience of understanding that led to that?
Not necessarily. You can learn a word in a language, and you can not know what that word means. And you can learn a lot of words in a language, but not know what that means. So, but if you do know what they mean, it actually can make it easier to remember that word and easier to chunk that word and easier to use those chunks to put together sentences. So for the most part, we always want chunking to involve understanding as well. But technically, no, you don't have to have understanding. It's just that understanding helps to kind of knit things together so that you can remember them more easily. For example, if I'm trying to learn the word duck, is pato in Spanish, okay, if I'm just going pato, I'm trying to remember that word, I don't have any understanding of what it means. It's kind of harder to remember. But if I know that pato means duck, I can say, what if I'm trying to remember it by having a little pato that my duck is floating in, and that can help serve as, that understanding helps serve as a bridge to get it into my mind. So that's a really good question, because people often think, oh, you build a chunk, it's automatic that you understand it. Not necessarily, but it's a very good thing to have, for the most part. So I thank you so very much for having me here.
Fantastic talk,
happy
great answers.
learning.
Thank you so much, Barb. Thank you.
It's time to grasp the flow of the big changes that are already underway, to look at the right and left, and to see far away. The Alvin Toffler, the futurist, said, "The future is not to predict, but is to imagine." Your future will be very different depending on which choice you make now. I designed the term project for artificial intelligence course aiming at learning how to learn. So enjoy your semester with the AI term project. Okay? Thank you.